Ready to roll?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay, we are broadcasting live to YouTube for another Tech Talk. And Nick and Melanie are gonna lead the show on this one because we wanted to talk about quiz analytics, quiz statistics.
Quiz statistics
statistics.
would be the title that Canvas gives it, and really there aren't too many actual elements to it. So as a tool, it kind of helps you get a little bit closer to the truth, but we'll kind of talk a little bit more about its uses and limitations. But it's just a nice thing to have kind of in your back pocket if you're someone that uses the Canvas quiz tool. So I'm going to share my screen and show that my way of doing that actually worked.
It totally worked.
But what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump out one version. So right now what we're in is just an example exam. And if you note in the top right under related items, that's where you'll find quiz statistics. So obviously this is going to be after the exam is over, or quiz, or whatever you're using.
So
Essentially.
this is the quiz that students have already taken.
Yes.
So there is student behavior data behind it.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. So we can actually get something out of it. So I'm gonna jump in there. And the first thing you'll note is once we are in the quiz statistics view, we get a quick summary. So average score, high score, low score, standard deviation, and then the average time it took to complete, and then just a quick plot. So a frequency for individual scores. So one person got somewhere in between 50 and 60. We know our low score is 55%. So we can just see how that information adds up there. And then below, we will see a full question breakdown for each item in the quiz, or exam, quiz, assignment, whatever you call it, but within the quiz tool. So when you are looking at these, a multiple choice question is going to give you the most information. Yeah. How's that for everybody? Better. Okay, so multiple choice question is going to give you the most information, and then other question types you won't get quite as much. So matching, for example, we were noticing earlier, you don't get something called a discrimination index. You just get a difficulty index, or essentially the proportion of people answering correctly. So that would be this number right here. But then you can still kind of go through and see who answered what. And what I mean by that is each of these little links, if you click it, will open up all of the student names that essentially selected that response.
So obviously we won't do that right now,
Yes.
but you could when you're looking at your own quiz.
There you go. Yes, so in the interest of not showing student data or quiz data like that, we'll kind of move past. But as you scroll through, you'll kind of see, okay, this was the correct response, and then these were the percentages of incorrect response, or what the distractors essentially achieved. And you can just go through the entire quiz that way. Now, most of this probably looks pretty familiar to how you've essentially interacted with quizzes in the past. What's my average score? What's my high? What's my low? Maybe you took the time to plot it out, but this might be a new one for you, discrimination index. And really what that is, it's an attempt to figure out the validity of the question. So how well the question is assessing what you want it to assess. Obviously, Canvas doesn't really know what you've taught the students, or what the students were doing at the time of the exam or quiz, or if they clicked the wrong button, or whatever weird confounding variables could essentially affect whether they got the incorrect or correct response. But what it does do is it takes and it looks at your your total distribution of essentially results, and it separates students into 3 areas, or 4 quartiles, as Melanie said, and then they just smush the middle one together. So we've got a top 27%, a bottom 20%, 27%, and a middle 46%. Okay. And so if I do this, and I already kind of know how many students fall into each, but if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this would probably be my cutoff for my bottom 27%. Okay. And then if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this would be the cutoff for my top So really Canvas is going to look at these folks and these folks. And then based on how many in the top percentage got the question right compared to the bottom percentage got the question right, Canvas will go, okay, this question does or does not discriminate between how well the student is actually going to perform on the exam as a whole. So it takes total score into play and then compares how this question relates to how well the student did overall.
Okay, so just so let me, because I'm
Yeah.
terrible at the statistics,
Okay.
so I'd like the
Let's
good
work through it.
control for this conversation.
Perfect.
So it's saying if a question is a quote unquote good question or a high discrimination question.
A high discrimination question or potentially a question that would be correlated with high validity.
Okay, so if it is a high validity question, then if a student did well on the test, then they're likely to have got the question correct. And if they did poorly on the test, they're likely to get the question wrong.
Yes.
So then the converse would be a bad question or a poor validity test, a poor validity question. How well the student did on the quiz overall is not very well correlated with how well they did on the question.
Yes.
Meaning either the question is way too easy and everybody got it right, or it was way too hard and everybody got it wrong, or not necessarily.
It could also mean that students in the low group performed well on that question, whereas students in the high group did not.
Okay.
Or that. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, no, and let's take a look at some examples, and I think it'll make it a little bit easier. So this one, so one thing about Canvas is discrimination index doesn't always, like when people actually assess that value or plot it out, doesn't always get lumped into 27, 27, 46. Sometimes it's just split down the middle. So Canvas also, with this kind of like way that they do it, they also view a low value on the discrimination index being 0.25 and lower going into the negative, whereas 0.25 and above going up to 1 would be a high discrimination question. So just keep that in mind. So some of this is a little bit what I would call arbitrary, especially since there's so many confounding variables. So as we kind of talk through this, just keep that in mind. This is Canvas's way of doing this. There's no like, a statistician probably would be able to correct me immediately, but I would argue that there isn't one correct way to truly assess this. It's more of different schools of thought. So that preface aside, let's go and let's look for a question that has basically a 0 discrimination index, because that's going to be a really great way for you to see how this is working.
So 0 means it is not a high validity question.
It means
Yes.
it's not discriminating between the top scores on the test and the low scores on the
Okay.
test
Yep.
at all.
Okay.
It's not telling us anything about how much that question measures what the overall test is trying to measure.
Okay, okay,
So a perfect 0 means that 100% of respondents either got it right or got it wrong.
okay.
And here's an example of that. Every student on this quiz got this question correct. So it can't discriminate. It
Okay.
doesn't, the top students, the bottom students, doesn't matter. This question, basically, it's a wash in the views of discrimination.
Okay.
But, you know, it's not always a bad thing, right? There are some questions that are just inherently a little bit easier, but you still have to assess them in some fashion.
Okay.
Maybe it's
Okay.
a part of your content that is kind of maybe just layperson knowledge that you might have just gotten over the course of living in society, or you know, thing,
But it's still foundational to.
but still
Other
required.
concepts,
And you
okay.
just have to know whether they're
Okay.
getting that or not.
So I was mistaken when I'm thinking of this as good questions versus bad questions. That's not
It
necessarily the
could be though,
case.
it could be. There could be some questions that are not well written, that
Okay.
are too nuanced, that don't touch on what's been covered in class. I mean,
Okay.
distractors that aren't fair.
And maybe the thing to think about is it's a way to dive further in.
So if I see a low discrimination index, doesn't necessarily mean the question is bad or wrong, but it does mean I should look at it and consider what it's doing and why it's doing it.
Yeah.
Okay,
That would be our workflow.
okay,
Just because there are so many confounding variables,
Sure.
but it can highlight some pretty weird things. You're like, oh my gosh, did I actually did I actually ask them that? Like I've had those moments before.
Mhm.
So it's a tool in the tool belt, but it's
Okay.
not like the source of truth.
Okay,
So
okay.
it's just one data point for a very holistic person that's working through these learning activities.
Okay.
So this is an example of a zero, right?
Mhm.
Everybody answered the same thing, so it doesn't discriminate. So could mean it's, you know, if we're also comparing it to obviously the difficulty index, could be just it's too easy, or it's supposed to be that easy, right? You might have designed it to be that easy. Things to keep in mind. Now let's move a little bit further down in the, I think, yeah, down the index, just for an example. So here, we've got a question where the discrimination index is negative. So we know it's, so anytime you're like 0.1 away from zero, that obviously would be very close to all respondents potentially answering the same thing. But here we've got an opportunity to look at what happens when you have, say, more of the individuals in the low end of your exam success doing better than the students in your
Oh.
high end of your exam success.
So this question is inversely related to overall quiz performance because of the negative discrimination index.
Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
So if I looked at the names here, so probably what I would do if I see something like this, and I think we're kind of all on the same page here. So, okay, negative 0.12, probably want to take a look at that. Okay, it looks like 79% of my students answered correctly. You know, that's not bad. What might be going on if I start looking into which respondents say got which results, and I go, oh my gosh, Caleb did really well in this exam, and he got this one wrong. Why did that happen? We would probably see that most of these 5 respondents, though we know, at least for this example, 6 and 6 on either side. You know, there's probably more of my top performing students in that 5 respondents than in this 19 respondents. And keep in mind, there's that middle 46% that's kind of a buffer, but when we see this negative value, that's usually what that means. So they're really students I would expect to do well or did well on this exam, didn't get this question. Students on the other end did. So is it a issue of I didn't cover the content right, or is it an issue of they were reading it too quickly, or maybe they have a couple of different ideas up in their head, whereas the students that might not have gone to certain class periods or whatnot, maybe them getting less information helped them navigate the question because they didn't have, you know, there you could postulate all sorts of weird reasons why this would occur, but sometimes at the end of the day, it's an opportunity just to throw out the question or reassess it in a better fashion and see if you're still seeing the same kind of information.
Yeah, sometimes it's a matter of coming up with different distractors, rephrasing the stem of the question. Or perhaps getting rid of it altogether, yeah.
There you go.
So like Melanie, as the content expert for these questions, when you look at this one, do you have a guess as to why the high performing students were getting it wrong?
I do, yeah, so I can look at that, so as an instructor, after this went through, if I were to go through this and that was flagged, I'd see it's red, it's a negative, that would definitely stand out to me, and I'd say, okay, let me look at this question, let me think about what probably went wrong. And yes, looking at that question, I can definitely come up with several ideas of why that came out that way, and so I would address that, if I were to teach it again, I would either address that through the way I'm teaching the content, the materials I'm using to teach the content, or I would rewrite that question and get rid of it, yeah.
Great.
And,
Awesome.
and in most cases, probably every case where I've seen a negative discrimination index like that, I can look at the question and I can think about probably some reasons why that would happen.
Cool. So this is like super helpful in my mind because, like you said, 79% of the students got this question right. If I'm just looking at quiz performance, this probably wouldn't stand out to me at all. But because of the discrimination index, it prompts you to look at it more closely and realize, oh, there might be a misalignment here.
Mhm. And that brings up a good point about outliers. So one of the things we can look at too is like, and I don't think there's any like perfect ones in this, which would indicate all of my top students. Oh, here's an example of one that wouldn't have a discrimination index because it's got multiple correct answers.
Okay.
But a positive one would indicate that all of your top percentile students got the question and none of your bottom percentile students got the question. But obviously that's pretty rare. But then that's also an opportunity. That's kind of an outlier. Like this
That
one's
one's super high.
pretty high as well. So I would also argue, look for the outliers too.
Mhm.
You know, and obviously the positives less of an issue, but thinking about it from kind of an equity standpoint, why are my low performing students all doing really poorly on this? Is there something else to kind of take a look at? You know, why would I have such a discriminating question? What is it about it that makes it really discriminating between the top and the bottom?
Okay.
Also just an opportunity, right? And I like this as a reflective practice, just in general.
Absolutely.
I'm seeing that Jennifer wrote in the chat, really wish there was more data for question types other than multiple choice. Yes. A huge limitation of this is that it only works for multiple choice questions just because of the statistics they're using.
So is that a limitation of the way Canvas is doing it, or is that just a limitation of the discrimination index as a tool itself?
A mathematical calculation of discrimination index.
Okay.
I'm not sure how the statistician again would be able to probably figure out maybe a way to do it with multiple like correct answers, maybe, but I think at the end of the day, the way that they're doing it, they need to have one correct answer to be able to determine how well that dictates score. Gotcha. Or correlates the score.
Okay.
And I'm sure there's some pretty potentially other ways to do it, but this is what we have available. And I resonate with your experience as well, Jennifer. I wish we had just also more information in general.
It's a consistent request of Canvas is, I wish we had more data and easier ways to access it. And we know that, and they know that, and it's an ongoing conversation.
And I'm just looking for, once again, looking for outliers like negative 0.41.
Yeah, that's not very good, right? We're definitely past that 0.25
Yeah.
mark on that one.
And you know, as an instructor, you can also make that call like 0.26. It's right at Canvas's cusp, but what, you know, does it mean? Well, 88% of my students answered it correctly. Okay, who are the students? Is that what I would expect? You know, there's a Jennifer just wrote in the chat. Not sure why they missed that.
And then winky smiley face, so I don't.
Must have been a problem with the instructor.
But again, it's that like you then can kind of take it on to kind of reflect on these moments and these specific items and go, okay, what was I trying to assess again? Okay, I'm right on that cusp, at least Canvas believes I am. Is that accurate? You know, is there an opportunity where I can, you know, in class, take these kind of low discriminating questions and ask students how they felt about it? Like there's also an opportunity to take this a little bit further if you need to, because this is only one data point or, you know, a collection or a specific type of data. You know, asking students maybe at the end of a quiz, you know, how well did you think you did? What did you really struggle on? What did you do well on? You think, you know, what was one you were just like, I have no freaking clue. You can kind of ask those questions and get a little bit more information to make this more powerful, essentially. Oh, well, Caleb's saying this question was really hard. He actually got it right, but a lot of the rest of the class didn't. What does that tell me? Oh, Caleb's got a confidence issue, and maybe I need to work through that with my students again.
Wow.
You know,
Okay.
Yeah, you didn't think we'd be diving into
No,
that today, did you?
personally attacked. And I don't even know why.
Um,
Okay. So this seems super helpful if you do a lot of multiple choice exams as an evaluation tool, as a tool for reflection.
Yeah, it's a good reflection.
And then, yeah, you can either, you know, reassess it in some fashion, you can give points back, remove the question altogether. Canvas gives you a couple of different ways to kind of go about that.
So wait, when you say remove the question altogether, would that actually regrade this particular exam if you did it that way, or would that be for future? iterations of the exam?
I was thinking future iteration
Okay.
because I don't know off the top of my head how that would work. Jerry, I'm gonna bat this one over to you.
Jerry might know.
Hopefully he's not on a call, but
I you just woke me up. Thanks for that. What are we talking about here?
Well, okay, so if we, let's say I gave this exam and I had 100 students or whatever, I don't know, 30 students.
Yeah.
And I went through the discrimination index tool and I found one question that I discovered was written incorrectly. I made a mistake as the. Could I go back and delete that question and regrade the students and just say, well, this was my bad, not your bad, so we're not going to calculate it in the quiz grade?
So if you delete the question from the quiz, you have to manually go in and regrade the quiz.
Oh, you do it manually.
Yeah. However, you can give the students fudge points for that. Say, put in there, you give them, say the question is worth 5 points, you give them 5 points, 5 fudge points. That adds points back in. So basically it zeroes that question out. And then you can put in the explanation, hey, question number 6 was poorly written or incorrectly written, and I gave you the 5 points for that question, whether you got it right or not. Now, you'd have to go in and look to see how you want to do it, because you may have some students that gotten it right. So then if you get it right, then all of a sudden, do you give them those points, 5 additional points for getting it right? Or, but if you do delete a question, you do have to go back in and regrade the exam manually.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Jerry. Cool. Well, is there anything else we wanted to touch on this?
I think I was just gonna look for any other outliers, but I don't believe there are. So with that, the last thing I want to do is scroll all the way back up to the top. You can imagine if it's a pretty long quiz, it'll do quite a bit of scrolling. So Control F, Command F for searching for keywords can be helpful. Quiz banks, that's a great question. If there is the potential that a question would have, let's see if I can remember how this works. So if you've got quiz banks and students are getting different questions, so it's not like here's all the different questions and then the randomized order
this
doesn't
question
matter.
no, you might get a different.
Yes, there's going to be that difference. Then from what I remember, it will have its own item for those questions. So it would be whoever got Caleb's question, your question A, you get question B. You'll have your own, there'll be an own item analysis for question A, there'll be an own item analysis for question B.
Okay.
And there shouldn't be overlap between Caleb and Melanie.
So in Jennifer's example, she has a bank of 40 questions, each student gets 20 questions. So when you're looking at the quiz statistics, it would show all 40 questions in a row, and then it would still calculate the discrimination index for the students that got that question.
Yeah, it's based on the number of students who
Okay.
received that.
And
Exactly, not based on the number of students in the class.
And I believe the attempts, it would tell you how many people attempted that question.
Okay,
And you'd be able to kind of determine,
that makes
hopefully
sense.
based off that. Another element, which I think this actually leads into nicely, is our item analysis. So student analysis is a student by student report. When you've got an item analysis, what that's going to do is, let's see if I think I just did that open. Let's do this. Let me share this. Open up an item analysis. See if it works for me. There we go. So, for example, if you did want to look a little bit deeper, this is an example of all of that information, but in a spreadsheet. And this is what I've highlighted is actually the first question. Doesn't do them in, say, the order you see them in Canvas, but it gives you a little bit more information about top student, middle student, bottom student, that essentially distribution. But in here, you would see, again, those other questions as well. It would just each is their own entity when it comes to the item analysis. And multiple attempts, I believe the most recent attempt supersedes past. Is that
Well,
accurate, or
I think
do
it's
they
based on
do?
how you set it, so so whichever score is saved, so if it's the highest score saved, is that what's in there versus?
Because because you're the one that sets how it's recording multiple attempts when you make the quiz.
You know, that's a good question, and it might even, I'll bat it over to Jerry, but.
Put him on the spot today.
Keep him on his toes. Jerry, do you know if the quiz statistics will have a specific view for each attempt? Or is it just going to be most recent score is added?
Actually, it's gonna be whatever the KEP score is. So, yeah, whatever the KEP score is what's gonna show up on the analytics.
Awesome.
So
Thank
if you have a quiz and you're giving your students 2 or 3 attempts, then you're probably gonna end up with a very different report, I would imagine. I would imagine students, if they're taking a quiz 3 times, they're more likely to just have the right answer by the 3rd attempt. So then the discrimination index may not be as clear any longer.
Potentially.
But
And we talked a little bit about like how well does the discrimination index work, say. Like with this, we've got a negative skewing, right? Negative skew.
Positive skew.
Is that positive skew? I thought, no, the tail goes negative, so.
Oh, okay.
You can tell our brains are, yeah, we've been in this one for a little bit. But depending on how the distribution looks, it could potentially affect, say, you know, you've got most of your results over at the top end. And say this tail is even closer into higher, I guess the high side of the scores. Your discrimination index might not have a lot of variation, right? Sure. It could be that we're talking about everything's, you know, really close to 0 because everybody's kind of doing well on the exam overall.
Gotcha.
Or like you said, after multiple attempts, people are doing better and better each time. So
they'll
when you-
compress the final distribution.
yeah, so and that's part of the reason why you might want to look at, say, outliers overall.
Mhm.
So what does the full scope of everything look like? And then you can kind of based off that get an idea. Okay, but yeah, you might not have as big a variation in your results.
I think that makes sense. Well, it looks like we're about out of time.
Oh, gosh.
Does this also work for new quizzes? Do they have the same
They
tool
do have
or,
quiz statistics.
and is it essentially the same thing or is it different?
It's essentially the same.
Maybe we can cover that one on another day.
Sure.
I assume more people are probably using this one for now.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this was actually super helpful. This is a tool that I didn't,
Thanks.
well, I mean, like, it's a tool I didn't know existed.
I think-
I've been playing with, worked with quizzes for a long time and I didn't know that you could do this kind of thing to really help yourself dive into questions that may need to be reevaluated. So that's super helpful.
Yeah, it is helpful, and I think, I mean, there's many times I've used it to, you know, I've seen questions that. At the end didn't pan out well for the students, and so I've used it to give them some credit back or to talk to them about different things, so I think it's
Great.
helpful for a lot of reasons.
Awesome. Well, I think we're probably gonna, any closing thoughts before I close the live stream?
You know, if you play around with it, just let us know kind of how your experience is and
If you need any help interpreting something, we would be happy
Yeah.
to look at it with you.
we'll do our best. Clearly, there's multiple schools of thought when it comes to interpretation, and
Okay,
it's an easy one to kind of get bogged down in, so.
cool.
All
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm gonna end the live stream.
Thanks all.